Well, greetings everybody, and welcome to tonight's session, kind of a special session on a topic that we kicked off a couple of weeks ago, in fact nearly a month ago. My name is Mark Robertson. I am founder and managing partner of Manifest Investing, and I'm joined here by Hugh McManus. Hugh is a pharmaceutical scientist in his day job, and I've known Hugh as an individual investor and a volunteer educator for almost 2 decades now, so it's a real treat for us to get an opportunity to spend some time with him here this evening. Tonight is actually part 2 of what I refer to as the pharmaceutical pipeline and how to discover opportunities, and that's what we're going to spend some time talking about tonight. I thought I'd go ahead and kick us off with just a couple of slides and then turn it over to Hugh. Let's get the legal stuff out of the way first. Hugh and I will be talking about real companies, real time, expressing some opinions, talking about our form of analysis in the investing world. And everybody here knows this, but no investment recommendation is intended. This is for educational and demonstration purposes only. One of the things that Kurt suggested that we probably should have done though last month, or between last month and now, is point out that one of the stocks Hugh will be talking about tonight has gone up 91% since we first started talking about it. So we probably should have touted it just a little bit more than we have. Sometimes we're just a little bit too humble about this kind of stuff. What I thought I'd do tonight is just kind of kick us off with a little bit of performance context. Those of you that are familiar with Manifest Investing know that we've been kind of delving into some of this performance-related material. And this is just to reiterate that we think many of the things, even though some of the stuff that Hugh will be talking about tonight is something that would be deemed non-core by some of our community, but there is a room for non-core, especially for experienced investors. We basically always like to focus on the facet of investing of forward-looking emphasis. We do like to be out there, looking for, discovering companies in their early stage of development, especially with some of the stuff that Hugh will be talking about tonight. One of the things that I did want to just reiterate is, you guys have seen us doing this for a while now. The chart that's on your screen right now is basically just taking a profile of some clubs or NAIC or Better Investing affiliated portfolios and just charting the fact that their relative returns are positive versus the S&P 500 over a certain number of years of operation. And then to give that a little bit more context, the next slide, this is gives some people a little bit of a headache, so I'll try to take it easy. What we've done is taken those same points now and just shared a whole bunch of institutional bullet points or portfolios. The red ones are professionally managed mutual funds or hedge funds, or however you want to think of it. The blue dots are either investment clubs or Better Investing influenced portfolios. The light blue dots are things that we do here at Manifest Investing. And just as one case in point, the Manifest 40. The Manifest 40 over a period now of almost 8 years is up at a performance advantage to the stock market, again measuring it by the S&P 500, of plus 5%. That's 5 percentage points above the market over a fairly decent number of years. And again, what's important about that is we know they're the most widely followed 40 companies that you guys track. It's really cool to see because we also believe they're probably fairly widely held by all of you. It's nice to see that type of performance happening. Solomon refers to our monthly selections in the monthly e-newsletter at Manifest. This other one here, though, just kind of, I don't know if thrilled is the right word. I just think it's so cool that this bare naked million that you see here, it's a barely managed, fairly passive portfolio that we did kind of on a whim. Somebody came to us about 5, almost 6 years ago now and said, what would you do with $1 million? We took that $1 million and put much of it into a Vanguard growth fund, growth stock ETF, and then we basically just went out and purchased a bunch of industry leaders when they appeared to be on sale. And we've only had like maybe 8 transactions in that portfolio over a period of 6 or 7 years, and notice the performance. One that I talked about a little bit today, and you can actually follow up on this in the funds portfolio of the folder within the Manifest Forum, is the American Funds ICA fund, mutual fund that's actually been in existence since 1934, and I did a little bit of debate / clarification with Dave Ramsey. You can have some fun with that. But notice that over a period of 84 years, that fund has come in at a relative return of nearly plus 1%. Again, that's fairly rare performance. I mean, notice how few are actually above our 5% objective. Notice how many of these red dots, remember I warned you about this, these red dots, with very few exceptions, have been selected using a Scrabble bag of letters. Literally, completely at random, and it's just wild to see all of these ending up at sub-market performance down here. And it's something that really makes us continue the quest and try to understand, even in much more detail, how well our colleagues in this community do, and not only that, how they do it. And how they do it is something that we want to talk about as much as we possibly can. Look at all these investment clubs starting to check in at extremely powerful performance. This Warren is Warren Buffett, by the way. And we'll probably come back to this subject if we have a little bit of time at the end. Hugh and I have been kicking around the possibility of what we've been referring to as a Legends series, where we might take a Peter Lynch or a Warren Buffett or a Walter Schloss and talk about and actually do a short presentation, much like the one tonight. We'd love to hear your thoughts on that if we have a little bit of extra time at the end. What I thought I'd do is, keeping it in that same vein of thought about performance over time, I thought I was going to be displaying something completely different from what you see here. What I've done here is gone to the exchange traded fund XBI, and it's an S&P biotech fund. So I thought it kind of dovetailed a little bit with what he's going to be talking about tonight. And I've discovered some fairly interesting things. First of all, I expected the red bars, these are year-over-year performance for this exchange-traded fund. I expected to see a little bit more volatility, more upside, more downside. I find it kind of fascinating that during the Great Recession, when stocks took a heavy hit, as shown here by the blue bar, the biotechs actually did pretty well. And then this kind of sets up Hugh for the subject tonight. In 2009, they actually didn't do very well when the stock market recovered. And I can actually remember phone calls with Hugh where he talked about how, it just didn't seem like these stocks were coming off of their bottom. All of these pharmaceutical development and biotech stocks seemed to be really lagging. And in his words at the time, didn't seem to have a whole lot of downside. So I find it kind of interesting that this biotech index fund, or ETF, has outperformed the S&P 500 4 out of the last 6 years. Here it is, placing it in the context of relative return, and again, this is since 2005. This is really kind of cool. The relative return since 2005 is actually in the neighborhood of a positive 4 to 5% relative return. And again, I'm just frankly stunned by that. So I have no idea whether those results are more representative over the longer term. Generally, these type of investments are going to be more volatile, but it certainly kind of underscores the notion that, well, sometimes you don't always get what you expect to see from the world of investing. And in the case of some of these, it is an area of opportunity and something to dig into. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Mr. McManus and ask him to take things away with tonight's presentation.
Thanks, Mark. Great introduction. Do I need to do anything here?
I don't think so.
Okay.
Do you want me to run the slides for you?
Yeah, sure, that's fine.
Okay, and I
just didn't know if there was a button that I had to press or something.
I'm showing pretty good volume, so just keep it at where you're at now.
Perfect.
Okay.
So thanks, everyone, and I got quite a bit of feedback. I'm sure maybe not quite a dozen, but 10 or 11 emails from different people with suggestions on what to do and how to organize the next talk. One of the common themes actually was that there were way too many slides, too many for a presentation and a little too few for a movie. There were a lot. So obviously I've cut back. And just so you know, the kind of deluge of slides was driven by the fact that Vivus, one of the companies that had a drug up for approval last month, was delayed by 3 months. So the idea was that when we planned this, was there would be a focus on one company, then a focus on the other, and hence the bit of scrambling. But it turned out to be a good thing in the sense that I think it organized the talk a little bit better. It's not really a comparison between two companies, but there are points where they can be compared. But it organized the talk a little bit better and focused it in, I think, a better direction. So here's a recap of what we're going to do this evening, and I promise you this time I won't run over. Just an overview of what we're all about, a recap of last month's episode, and then we'll take a look again at the drug approval process. I was asked by a number of people just to go through that one more time. Then I'd like to just delve into various aspects of Vivus and Arena, and I held off on this looking at Orexogen when I was trying to time this, adding Orexogen, which is a third company whose drug isn't really up for approval at the moment, but will be in probably 2 years. Adds too much time to the talk. A little bit of a look at the latest news and then what's next, and we'll have a time for wrap-up and questions. So if we move along to the next slide. So what we covered last time in 100 plus slides is we took a look at the Food and Drug Administration. We didn't really look at the European equivalent, although we talked on that. Talked about what a drug is and what it's supposed to do, and looked a little bit at the drug development process. Reviewed clinical trials, and we talked about the filings that companies make and the fate of what's called an NDA, or a new drug application. It's an application to the Food and Drug Administration to have marketing approval, to allow the company to sell the drug over the counter, not that often, but generally via prescription, to the general populace. And then what occurs after an NDA is filed. And we'll be echoing back on these things right now because it's current. The two companies that we're talking about, one is called Arena Pharmaceuticals, based in San Diego. The other is Vivus, based in the Bay Area, Northern California, probably geographically Central California, San Francisco area. Both of these companies filed an NDA last year, and this filing is currently being reviewed by the FDA. So if we go on to slide number 9, just to recap, what is a drug? I mean, it consists of a molecule, a chemical entity or a biological entity that does work, and it also includes what are called inactive ingredients. There's an active pharmaceutical ingredient and an inactive ingredient. They're not really passive. They're inactive in the sense that they aren't responsible for the intervention, but they can help the active molecule get to where it needs to be in sufficient concentration to survive the journey through, say, the dietary tract and so forth. A drug has an approved form. It could be a tablet, it could be an injectable. The labeling has to be approved, as does the packaging material and the inserts. And the inserts are the sum total of what can be claimed and what pharmaceutical representatives can claim when they talk to physicians and other interested parties. This is what constitutes a drug. It's more than just a tablet. It's everything. It's the packaging, the labeling. All of these are carefully controlled, and all of them are monitored by companies to try and reduce fraud. Very, very difficult thing to do. There are, sadly, criminal entities that put fraudulent material into the drug supply, but at least in the U.S. and Europe, there's a very, very good way of trying to prevent or minimize that, and it's been active for some time. The next slide shows the product life cycle of a typical drug. Going from left to right, time increases. In the early stage, costs are incurred in developing the drug. It has negative revenue. It just incurs costs. This phase can last as long as 7 to 10 years. And once a company files a patent, the patent clock starts ticking. So the 20 years of patent exclusivity that a company can get can be gobbled away over time as the drug marches through the discovery, development, and ultimately the filing process. There is usually a lag when a drug is launched before it reaches its peak sales. That can vary from 3 to 7 years, depending on how good the company is marketing its own product and how well it's taken up by doctors. And the other big imponderable is, what are the competitors doing? If another drug goes generic, It may not be as effective, but it can erode market share of a patented drug. But overall, once patent expiration occurs, which means that generic competition ensues, that people can actually then start to produce approved versions of the drug, that's when revenue starts to plummet again. The life of the drug is really over for the innovator. The market share is gobbled away by generic companies. And the whole cycle starts again through discovery, etc. But 70% of drugs actually are not profitable. It's a tough thing to measure profitability because you have to factor in there the losses that are incurred in developing drugs. And of course, the other big factor is, from an accounting perspective, these losses are expensed immediately. The fact of the matter is, no matter how you cut it, the majority of drugs are not profitable. And pharmaceutical companies actually turn out to be engaged in a very high-risk enterprise because most of the things that they work on fail, and most drug companies ultimately go away through merger or acquisition. I have a slide that actually shows the family tree, if you will, of Bristol-Myers Squibb. It consists of about 100 entities. Company keeps buying things and adding them on. But it's a tough business to be in, but if you get it right, and you produce the right material, think of Lipitor as an example, it can be highly profitable because if you sell many copies of these drugs, you can improve your manufacturing process within limits and garner higher margins. So drugs that are successful can be highly profitable. And as an example, Amgen, which is one of the more successful drug companies, it's in the biotech space, but it is a drug company, had pre-tax margins for many, many years rivaling anything else in the country, about 40%. Kind of huge. So if we move on, I just want to review some of the slides that we did before. I was asked to do this. This is the stages of clinical development. You have discovery, which I said lasts a few years, preclinical, that's before it goes into people. Then you have the clinical trials, and the clock tends to start ticking, the patent clock tends to start ticking over on the left in the discovery phase once the patent for this new entity is filed. It takes about 6 months to a year after the clinical trials are completed and the NDA is ready to file what's called a new drug application, to have that reviewed by the agency, and then to ultimately receive marketing approval. And at that point, the patent life is about 5 to 10 years. And as I mentioned last time, Mark and I gave a presentation with investor relation representatives from Sanofi Aventis a few years ago. Very successful company, suffering a little bit now, could be good for long-term investors. And they kindly provided this slide. So if you look over on the left, Mark just highlighted the fact that there's really very few years of patent exclusivity once a drug is launched. Companies, as I said, have to start all over again. So just on the next slide, we can just quickly go through the process just to provide some context for what we're going to talk about. You have to identify a problem, and then you have to develop an intervention, a drug, to try and stop it. Interrupt that biological process that's causing some harm in some way. The challenge here is that you're introducing, believe it or not, a poison into the body. And I think I talked about this last time. The goal is that this poison affects one and only one biological process and really does less or no harm to anything else. It's a very high bar to reach. Thousands of molecules can be screened against a biological target. Very few of them could show activity, and those that do are developed further. And in the two companies that we're looking at in this talk, one is Vivus, the other is Arena. Vivus produced a drug called Qnexa, by the way. Arena produced Lorqess. The nice thing about these companies is they contrast greatly. Arena is an innovator. This is a brand new molecular entity with a different mechanism of action. Whereas Qnexa consists of two pharmaceutical molecules, one of which has been approved for almost 50 years. Topiramate and phentermine, we'll talk about those briefly in a moment. Whereas Lorqess selectively targets what's called a 5-HT2C receptor. It gives you a feeling of being full. Some people will argue that because Lorqess consists of only one component, it puts it at a bit of a disadvantage. It would be actually nice to combine lorcaserin with phentermine, a well-known entity that can reduce weight, and that would really turbocharge the product. But because lorcaserin, the molecule, is a brand new chemical entity with a different mechanism of action, the FDA demands, initially at least, that there be a monotherapy, that this drug be tested and sold in the population overall, as long as it's safe and effective, before it's sold in as a combined entity with something else. So moving on to the next slide, I talked about the mechanism of action, and the FDA insists that you know at a molecular level how this drug works. It needs to know what it's stopping, what biological mechanism it's interrupting, and what could be other concomitant problems that it could create with other mechanisms. You need to know what the fate of the drug is. What are the metabolites? When the body starts to gobble it up and eat it, where do they go? Are these metabolites themselves active? And what are the degradants? Chemistry happens all the time, so what other molecules can occur if the drug naturally degrades into its constituent components, or any of those harmful? If we move on to the next slide, I just talked a little bit about this idea of first in class. It's a drug with a novel mechanism of action that hasn't been seen before and of which the FDA has no experience. It can actually trigger a lot of interaction with the agency, which is generally a good thing, and there's a link to a document that helps support that companies that tend to interact sufficiently with the agency tend to do well. And it turns out that a drug that is first in class, that has a novel mechanism of action, has a higher approval rate than many drugs that are Me Too's or follow-ons. It's often the case from a market perspective that it may not be the most successful product. The follow-on actually could do a little bit better, but it does give the innovator, the company that generates this novel entity, a few years head start. So if we go on to the next slide, then we can talk about screening against a target. I touched on this recently. So you need a biological process that you want to interrupt, and you want this molecule that you've developed to interrupt the process. And in fact, screening can happen against thousands and thousands of possible drug candidates or drug molecules. Generally, a target is found, and you have a library of compounds, and you screen that library. It consists of millions against to see if it works. There are other ways of doing it. There are different ways of discovering drugs. One of them is to have what's called, I guess you could call it an intelligent drug design. You kind of map out on a computer what you think the target looks like. You develop a drug to fit that target and shut it down. But very few companies practice that, and I'm not too sure if, I believe there's only 2 or maybe 3 molecules that are now on the market that have been clearly developed that way. And by the way, Arena targets what's called a G protein coupled receptor, a GPCR. You'll see that very often. It's found liberally throughout the body in many different processes, and about 1/3 of all drugs that are on the market today target this signal pathway using GPCR receptors. So if we move on to the next slide, one of the things that you have to demonstrate is you need to know what happens to the drug when it goes into the body. And you do 2 things. One is called pharmacokinetics, and one is called pharmacodynamics. Pharmacodynamics, you're really looking at what the drug does to the body, how it binds. Pharmacokinetics, you're looking at what the body does to the drug. And you measure what the concentration of the drug is in the blood plasma to make sure that you have an adequate concentration to do work. You've already modeled it in the lab, and you might actually start modeling the thing in animals. And when you get into humans in phase 1 trials, you want to be able to demonstrate, come to this in a second, that the concentration of the drug in the body matches what you've observed in your previous preclinical studies. Next slide just talks a little bit about what's called ADME, absorption, distribution, metabolism, and excretion. It's really to look at the fate of the drug once it gets into the body. Where does it go and what does it do? And for the case of Qnexa, I believe most of the pyramid that's in there actually ends up in being passed through the body and goes into the sewage system at some point or another. But that's normal. Many times the drug can go straight through the body without doing anything. Many times a lot of the active ingredient can be gobbled up in different processes, including the liver, as it tries to get to the point of pain. And ADME is often combined with tox because you want to look at model systems and you want to see in animals if any toxicity or toxic events occur on the systems in the body. It's often abbreviated actually as ADMET, A-D-M-E-T. Once you've demonstrated in your model systems in your animals that the drug is safe and that you recognize what the dose needs to be to get to the point of pain, you escalate that dose to see when you start to have an onset of problems, and then when you want to go into humans, you would back away liberally from that horrible concentration that can cause effect, and then you move into what's called clinical trials, when you start to administer the drug to humans. You need to get approval from the FDA to do that, and there is a process called an IND, or Investigational New Drug Application, which is filed with the agency. And generally, if the agency doesn't respond within about 30 days, you're free to move forward. But it's good to be in constant dialogue with the agency, as I pointed out before, because generally it's companies that do that can get a head start on any potential problems, have an idea of how the reviewers are possibly thinking about the drug or about the indication, and you're better able then to position yourself for success. If we move on to the next slide, we're going to just talk about clinical trials really briefly, and we're going to look at those in more detail when we come to talking about the two drugs, Qnexa and Lorqess. Generally, it's a controlled experiment where a drug is administered to humans. It's double-blind. That means that the person getting the drug and the person administering the drug doesn't know if they're actually treating with the intervention or whether they're using a placebo or a control. That goes to the next point where things are controlled. In other words, you're measuring against either non-intervention, a placebo, or you're measuring against what's called the standard of care. And for areas where there could be serious consequences to not treating a disease, such as cancer, patients are not put on placebo. They are actually given the standard of care, and the new drug is measured against that. And then finally, it's randomized. So in other words, you want to have a statistically valid sample, and you want to make sure that any kind of effect that could be generated by, say, the population of people in a given city, etc., age, etc., is all cancelled away or negated by the fact that things are randomized. Not can't be completely negated, but at least randomization reduces the chance of weird things happening. And the goal in the clinical trial is to make sure that a drug is safe and that it's effective. And because you can't really test a drug in the population overall, you want to make sure that your clinical trial results are representative of the entire population, so that you can infer something about the drug if it were administered to everyone on the planet who needs it. Things are carried out under good clinical practices, and people are given what's called informed consent before they agree to take part in the trial, and they can withdraw at any point that they wish. They're generally conducted in clinical settings, and later on, as you move through from the phase 1 and 2 studies into the phase 3 clinical trial, things are all normally carried out in hospitals. If we move on to the next slide, it just summarizes the 3 stages of a clinical trial. I'll skip to the slide after, slide 20, because we'll come back to these later. The studies have endpoints. You're measuring something. You must ask a good question, and you must measure it against an endpoint. You have to be able to measure it. You determine it before the trial starts, and you have to meet it. You have to meet that endpoint. Let's say for a weight control drug, you might argue that over the course of X number of months, the subjects have to lose on average 5% of their weight, and it has to be placebo controlled. So they have to lose 5% more than the group that's in the group that represents the control of the placebo. And for fatal diseases, survival is a good endpoint, but very often nowadays, especially in some cancers and in viral infections, surrogate endpoints are gaining ground. There are secondary endpoints as well, and these are talked about briefly on the second slide. So for weight control drugs, not only might you lose weight, but they might measure your waist circumference and see if that is reducing. They might look at sugar levels in the blood, they might look at insulin levels, etc. And see if all of these are improving. Heart rate might be going down, blood pressure is lowering, etc. And the other type of endpoint is a surrogate endpoint. Talked about those briefly a second ago. They're not relevant for this conversation, but they can be if a company is to be given special consideration by the FDA, but it's not really relevant in this case. So on the next slide, it just talks about filing an investigational new drug. You've done all your work, and then you want to start administering the drug in humans. And the first thing you do, which is shown on the next slide, is a phase 1 clinical trial. And in a phase 1 clinical trial, what you're doing is a controlled experiment. You need to measure safety. You're looking at pharmacokinetics, what the drug does in the body. And you want to make sure that you're subjecting healthy volunteers to this treatment, at least initially, so there are no complicating events. And you can actually see clearly the effects of the drug versus any inherent illness that's in the patient. So having healthy volunteers is really key in this stage to investigating whether or not the drug is safe. Now, it turns out that for some interventions, such as cancers, etc., generally you would look at subjects who have the indication, that have the problem. And the challenge there is that these drugs often have more serious side effects than, let's say, a common weight reduction tablet or some other drug that's on the market today for Lipitor as an example, or cholesterol. And so for that reason, that you want to make sure that if you're going to subject people to a certain amount of risk, that there must be some benefit associated with it. So drugs that have inherent risk with them, and these are usually drugs that treat serious, very serious illnesses, target something else other than healthy volunteers in phase 1. And actually they would do a combo phase 1/phase 2. So on the next slide, talks about what you get out of phase 1 trials. You're looking at finding out what dose of the drug can be tolerated, and if that dose is sufficient to do the work that you've demonstrated in your preclinical work, concentration of blood is sufficient to get to the point of pain, then that's good. It can be tolerated at that level. You want to make sure that there aren't any serious toxicity issues. Even minor ones should be looked at. And as I said before, you have to make sure that it matches what you've already seen in your model systems, your animal studies, etc. Now, in clinical phase 2, on the next slide, we move in then to looking at efficacy, seeing if the drug works. Generally here, the group is divided. The group of people who have agreed to participate in the trial, they're divided into 2 or more groups. At this point, obviously, you're looking at people who have the illness of interest, and you want to see if the drug is effective against that. But this is a minor trial, and it's still really prepping the groundwork for the pivotal phase 2 clinical trials that really show if the drug is effective. But you want to demonstrate to some extent efficacy. You want to make sure that this efficacy is measured against the control, which in many cases is placebo, and for more serious illnesses is the standard of care. Again, you're looking to make sure there are no toxic issues. You might be doing escalating dose studies to see what the impact is on the illness. And the key thing that I just want to say here is designing a good phase 2 clinical trial is critical. And companies that are good at doing this can really get predictive information about how well they'll do in phase 3. As an investor, if I look at a company that is constantly canceling programs after phase 2, unless it's for toxicity issues, which is a whole different issue, but if they discover that the efficacy that they discovered in phase 2 is in no way matched in phase 3 and they're off by a wide margin and they continue to do that, I tend to avoid those companies because they're just not potentially designing trials well. Now, there's always a chance that you could actually just have bad luck. That happens. But good companies that are focused, that state very good questions and develop trials in the protocol to answer them tend to be able to run a phase 3 trial that is successful if they've already got good results in phase 2. Just my observation. And then if we skip to the next slide, it talks about a critical meeting that happens with the FDA once these phase 2 trials are completed. At that point, you've got the proof of concept presumably nailed, and it's a brand new mechanism of action. You've indicated that what you said you were going to do works. And so you meet with the FDA and you have a discussion about what you need to do to demonstrate that this drug is actually an effective treatment against the problem that occurs in patients, against the illness. i.e. you want to design very successful, good phase 3 clinical studies. A meeting with the FDA at this point is kind of critical to that goal. I'm going to skip the next slide and move on to slide number 24. 29, which talks about the clinical phase 3. This is really the gold standard. Again, it's multi-centered, randomized, controlled. Here you're really trying to mirror the real world effects that you want to see in your drug. You're really trying to mirror the patient population overall. And this trial is the one that really will determine whether or not the drug works. Generally, the FDA looks for 2 trials, 1 trial supporting information, but it's really 2 trials. You want the subjects to be typical of the overall patient population. Now, the trial is often conducted in an outpatient setting or a hospital, which kind of makes it a little bit wacky. But phase 3 clinical trials, to some extent, in many circumstances, mirror exactly what people would do in the real world. You have to develop criteria for enrolling patients, and this would all be determined from your phase 2 results, as well as excluding people. You want to make sure that the results you get mirror or answer the question that you ask. And depending upon the extent of the illness or the possibility of side effects, unwanted side effects, these trials can be very large, involving hundreds, and in many cases, say for heart studies, thousands of patients, so that you can capture adequately kind of rare events and say something predictive about them. Once again, the drug or the intervention has to show statistical significance against the control. And in a phase 3 trial, it can often be what's called a factorial design. It's answering many questions at once in different subgroups or cohorts of people who have the illness. And on the next slide, we just talk about other considerations. As I said, normally 2 phase 3 trials are required. The FDA wants to make sure that they're not going to approve a drug that doesn't work. And so they say, listen, we want to set a limit. You have to be at least 5%, there has to be at least a 5% chance that the results you generate could be generated just by chance. And in fact, in many trials, it's much lower than that. And by virtue of the fact that you develop 2 phase 3 clinical trials, it reduces the possibility that the results you get could have happened just randomly. Once that is completed, on slide 31, talk about the new drug application. It's a very large document. It's, well, I've moved on actually to 32. Sorry about that, Mark. It's a very large filing consisting of thousands upon thousands of documents. It shows all of the data that was collected preclinical, during the clinical trials, all of the supporting lab work that was conducted, submissions from consultants that may have worked on the project, submissions from the clinical trial sites, etc. And this is all reviewed by the FDA. There's an initial review where they determine whether they have sufficient material from the company to make a determination of whether the drug is safe and effective, and then a final review which either gives or denies marketing approval for the drug. The FDA has reported that it receives almost half of the submissions in the 4th quarter of the year. And this is based on data that was collected from 2002 to 2007. And then on the next slide, it looks at the fate of some of these NDAs. We're not going to go through this, but you have copies of this. Down the bottom left, if you Google either the FDA's first cycle review performance or click on the link, you'll find actually the document from the agency. But the goal here is that about of the 185 products that were reviewed, about half of them were approved in the first cycle, and then it took about another year and a half to approve a further 50% of those outstanding submissions. So the approval rate is quite high, 77 to 78%, but it can take time. So just going on to the next slide, I want to talk about a thing called PDUFA date, which we hear a lot about recently. When the FDA gets a new drug application, it issues, first of all, what's called a 74-day letter. And this letter tells the company if they have accepted the filing, if what the company has submitted is sufficient for the FDA to make a determination whether the drug is safe and effective. If it's not sufficient, they may go back and look for more information. But once it is sufficient, they will issue what's called a PDUFA date. For a normal review, it's 10 months after the company files its NDA. If the FDA grants priority review, then it will have a decision within 6 months. And for both Qnexa and Lorqess, for this second filing that was completed late last year, the FDA granted priority review. Now, in the case of Qnexa, the review date was initially April 17th, but then that was moved forward by 3 months for point I'll talk about in a second, because a safety study had to be completed. Not quite a study, but a risk evaluation and mitigation strategy had to be approved by the FDA, agreed upon between the FDA and the company. And small companies generally put a lot of information on their website. Larger companies, the Mercks and Pfizers of the world, because this information may not be material to the bottom line, very often do not. So if we move on to the next slide, oh, that slide got moved on me. I'll move on to the slide after that, because I want to just give some more resources that you can use. I was asked a few questions by people working. They read about clinical trials or the drug application process. I got this book about a week ago. It's one of the best that I've read. It's really excellent, and although it is 258 pages, you can read it pretty quickly. I was flying around last week to different meetings and managed to read it on the plane. It's by a gentleman by the name of Lawrence Freedom. Love the way he writes, love what he has in the text, and it's not that expensive. The price I was quoted on Amazon was $15 plus. Now there are some used copies available from other publishers. They're $14 for a new copy, slightly more expensive for a used copy. So the Amazon price here is very good. And then if you want to read a second book on the subject, on the next slide there's a book called Drugs, a very short introduction. It's published over 10 years ago, but it's a nice read. It explains things quite nicely. Again, available on Amazon. A little promotion here for Amazon.com. Available on Amazon for $11.95, but there are new other vendors that sell it less expensively, and you can get a used version for under $4. But of course, if you go that route, I think you have to pay for shipping and packaging, etc. Whereas if you're a Prime member on Amazon, you can get that for free. So on the next slide, I talk briefly about A Drug's Life. This is to echo, kind of a pun on A Bug's Life, but it's kind of echo what I talked about before. That there are key events in the life of a drug, especially if it's an emerging company, that can have a major impact on the stock price, depending upon how that stock is doing. Early on, as a drug moves from a discovery into preclinical and clinical trials, it really doesn't have much of a boost on the stock price because most drugs at that point just don't move anymore. And in fact, in most cases, you really don't know what's going on in preclinical. Companies might want to tell you if they want to try to give the appearance that they have a super great pipeline, but most of those programs just fail. Clinical trials is where it matters, phases 1, 2, and 3, and particularly phase 3 if it's a proof of concept studies. The other events that are important would be an end of phase 2 meeting, a company reports good news from that, or a pre-NDA meeting with the FDA before they actually file their application. But the big things that tend to move stock prices is an advisory committee, or the point at which the FDA makes a decision as to whether or not marketing approval is granted to the NDA. And the FDA will either say it's not approvable, which happens in some cases, or they can issue what's called a complete response letter detailing what the company has to do to improve defects in its filing. Of course, the one thing companies would love to hear is that the drug is approved. So they get an approval letter from the FDA and they're ready to go. There would be dialogue before that happens, of course, to make sure that the labeling is all worked out, etc. But generally, that's the thing that you want to see. And then on the next slide, I just recap again for you exactly what I talked about before. The 74-day letter is a key event. The end of phase 2 or pre-NDA meetings are key points as well. And these are often highlighted on emerging companies' websites, but you often don't see them, unfortunately, when you're dealing with major companies. Not a big deal because these events don't really move the stock price of the Mercks, Pfizers, etc. of the world, but they can have a huge impact on companies like Arena or Vivus. So I was going to suggest, Mark, if I were to take over control, because I just want to bounce through some of the some websites, if you don't mind.
Sure, we can do that.
There we go. Oh. So I just wanted to run through the FDA website again, just really briefly, because I was asked this question, and then we'll get to the filing documents. So somebody actually couldn't find how you get to an advisory committee, and it's not that hard. It turns out when I looked at some of the different older computers, because I searched to the FDA website on an older computer to see how it would appear on a browser that is kind of 7 or 8 years old, the one I'm using here. Oops, it turned out that some of the links that I was talking about last time, I talked about the fact that they appear over on the far right-hand side. And then I used another browser and it didn't appear there, and I wondered where they went. But you can always find what we're talking about down at the bottom if you want to get it to advisory committees. I'm not going to go through everything I've talked about in the slide, but you can get a list of drugs that are approved. You can look at various different pieces of information, but I just wanted to recap advisory committees. So you go down to advisory committees. You're interested actually in looking at drugs. Well, I see what's happening here. Because I've changed the screen so that we can actually record this effectively. So messes things up for me. But if you click on drugs, then you will arrive at the drugs advisory committees. And the one that we're interested in here is the Endocrinologic and Metabolic Drugs Advisory Committee, the NASDAQ, which is the one that has supervision over the applications that were filed by both Vivus and Arena. When you click on that, and then click on the meeting materials for 2012, this is for, thank you, FDA, you get a list of everything that you need to know about the drug once this information is published. It is published 2 business days before the scheduled date of the advisory committee meeting. And if I scroll down to the end, the first meeting this year of NASDAQ was on the 22nd of February, and this is where they discussed the Vivus NDA. So all of the materials are available here, including the minutes of the meeting and the transcript, which appeared on the website at 8 o'clock this morning. And there you can see a kind of an interesting discussion on the teratogenic nature of pyramid, which is one of the components in the drug. There was a meeting on the 28th and 29th, which just talked about cardiovascular trials for a new guidance on weight therapies, and yet not yet published, so not really that relevant to the 2 applications, but it didn't really stop the FDA asking questions about of Arena, or of the committee about Arena's application and what should actually be done based upon the meeting that happened in March. And then finally, the Arena meeting occurred in May, just last week, May 10th, and all of the information posted to date is available here. Fortunately, don't have any in slides, which I love to see the slides. They're quite nice to follow. The slides weren't published on the website just yet. And it's very easy to follow the FDA. You can look on this website yourself. Down to the bottom, you can either link to get regulatory information, or you can follow the FDA on a whole host of different types of interactive media. And they have a list of interactive media that is supported by the site, and this list is long. Actually, if you delve into it, you'll discover there's about 200 different ways you can abstract information from the site. To put it on your own website, or to have it put in your mailbox regularly, or to have a syndication feed to your browser. So the other resource that I talked about briefly last week was clinicaltrials.gov. Very easy to find, just www.clinicaltrials.gov. And then if you wanted to say look at Qnexa, which was the drug from Vivus, type it into the search engine and you get a full list of all of the clinical trials that the company has either started, or in this case has completed. By the way, sometimes you also need to know the company's code number for the drug. So for example, for Arena, Lorqess was assigned as a name, I think, in the end of 2007 or thereabouts. Before that, it was known as ADP 356. So if you type just Lorqess or Lorqess, which is going to be the marketed name for the drug, you probably will not necessarily find all of the information about clinical trials. You need to know all the names under which the drug is known. So unfortunately, this actually didn't work out as well as I had hoped, because I could go back to the clinical trial website. We can actually display different options. If we click on this, it gives you a box that appears. It allows you to also have information in phase, number enrolled, the primary completion date of the study, the outcome measure, and the final completion date. And all of these are kinds of things that I check on this box to get full information about what's going on. And I've already set this up here so that all of these boxes should already be checked. And you get much more information under each heading for a clinical trial so that you can identify the clinical trial of interest. And more importantly, often for investors, if you look at when the first data is likely to be published from the trial or when it's likely to be completed, you can gauge for yourself, say, a primary completion date in this case, or the final completion date on July of 2010, you can judge for yourself what might actually move the stock price if the results turn out to be good, or if you're a short seller, I guess, or somebody who likes put options, if it tends to be bad. We talked about this before, so I'm just going to skip over that point. But there's some things that can happen in a clinical trial that you want, and some things that you don't want. So if it turns out that a drug is both safe and effective, a good outcome for everyone involved is that the trials demonstrate that point. But a bad outcome for the company, not so much really for FDA to some extent, but certainly for the company, is that if you have a drug that is safe and effective, but the clinical trials doesn't demonstrate that, you get a certain type of error. And that can occur. A good drug goes bad for no other reason than just chance, or a poorly designed trial, or a question that wasn't properly asked, and you got results that you didn't really want. And then there's another scenario where you could have a drug that is both not efficacious and it's not safe. And if the clinical trials demonstrate that, then you're fine. But let's say you have a drug that is very effective but turns out not to be that safe, and the trial doesn't show that. It actually indicates that it's a good drug. That's bad. That you don't want to happen, and that's something, an error that the FDA in particular doesn't want to happen. It doesn't want a bad drug to get on the market. So the FDA's main goal really is avoid approving a drug that is bad. And the company has to design its clinical trial such that it avoids failing to show that a good drug is really a good drug. So really you're trying to demonstrate safety, you're trying to demonstrate efficacy, that it works, and you're trying to demonstrate both, that it's both safe and effective. And what's implied by these statements is really that the people who are in the clinical trial are representative of the overall population. Now, there's lots of studies that show that they're not. There's lots of studies that show in clinical trials people who sign up for these things are much better motivated, and that when you get into the real world, you just don't get as good results as you would hope for. That's just the way life is. And you also you don't want to get a false positive. You don't want a bad drug to show that it's good in clinical trials, and you want to try to avoid that as best you can. You also want to design the trial. You want it big enough that it will capture all the serious adverse events that could occur in the general population. And for the case of Vioxx, it was argued that the trials weren't large enough, they weren't what's called powered enough to catch all the problems that could occur when you give that treatment to millions upon millions of people. The bad consequence there is that once these very serious adverse effects start showing up, the drug gets pulled completely. But if you had asked the right questions at the get-go, and you were able to corral the group that is most at risk of having a bad event, if you were able to identify who they were, often a high bar, but if you were able to do it and include on the label and the information of the drug that these people shouldn't be administered the drug, you can prevent yourself from living a whole world of hurt as it goes later on. And there are two main types of trials. And I bring this up because I was asked a question about, I believe it was a Lorqess trial, which talked about non-inferiority. But you want, there's really two types. The non-inferiority, I'll just talk about briefly first. You want to show that the intervention is at least as good or no worse than something that's already on the market. These trials are getting more common. And by the way, that might be a trial that is used to demonstrate that for its safety profile, it's no worse than something else. But the big trial, the one that you really work on in a clinical trial, is you want to show that the intervention is equivalent to something else. That's what you're demonstrating. That's what you're trying to demonstrate. But you really want to show that it's better and that result is statistically significant. If it's worse, you've wasted the money. You've wasted your money. And the other terms you're often going to see when people talk about these clinical trials is a p-value and a confidence interval. And the confidence interval is just a way that tells you how confident you are that the result you're seeing is actually, if you will, representative of the overall population. A kind of short and sloppy shorthand way of describing it. Whereas this p-value really could be summarized as saying that what are the chances that the event you're monitoring could happen just by chance. And turns out that I am math challenged, because the p-value isn't normally set at 0.5 or 0.1. That'd be pretty meaningless. It's usually set at 0.05 or 0.01, somewhere in that range. And generally, when you see the smaller the p-value you see for a result, and the result, say for Qnexa, where the p-value is 0.001, that's highly statistically significant. The chances of it occurring just by random events is minimal or negligible. So to summarize, if a drug is good and the clinical trials are successful, that's a good outcome. But if the drug is good and the clinical trials don't demonstrate that, I think the company has messed up. The one thing the FDA doesn't want to see happen is a bad drug having successful clinical trials. Or one thing everyone would like, the FDA particularly would like to see, is that a bad drug it's demonstrated as such in a clinical trial. Of course, the company doesn't do clinical trials of the drug. It knows it's bad. It assumes it's good. But if it turns out to be bad, you want to be able to show that in the trial. Just want to talk just briefly about the weight management guidance. The FDA creates guidance for people. Oh, this is interesting. Nice. And I have a link to this document on the presentation itself. And if you want me to send you a copy of it, if you can't find it, that's fine. But this is the guidance for weight reduction drugs. Unfortunately, the screen is pretty big here, but no matter. You can scroll through this document to find out all of the information that you need to understand what the FDA demands of companies that are developing such drugs. You can go down to page 6, which I will do right now, quick and dirty, to look at what the efficacy benchmark is. It talks here about what obesity is, how it categorizes, etc., what the body mass index is. I don't like to scroll down like that because it just irritates people's eyes, but it talks about the design of phases 1 and 2 and the design of phase 3. And then finally it talks about what the efficacy endpoints for the trial should be. It has a mean and a categorical. And the mean is the difference in percent body weight between the group on the therapy and the control. In this case, it's a placebo-treated group. And the categorical is defined as the portion of subjects who lose at least 5% of baseline body weight in the active product versus placebo. And as you go further down this document, there are also the secondary endpoints, which we talked about earlier. There's the standard of care. It says that in general, a product should be considered effective for weight management if after a year of treatment, either of these two goals is met, either the mean or the categorical. A lot of discussion occurred around Arena because people argued that it did not meet the efficacy goal. It turned out it did. But it didn't meet both of them. It met the categorical but not the mean. Small point, but important for some. And if you look at the Qnexa data, they had about 2,500 patients. In terms of efficacy, I think it knocked it out of the park. Phenomenal results, really. 48% on the high and 37% on the mid-dose lost more than 10% of body weight. That's clinically meaningful. It can have a major impact on health to lose that much body weight. There were side effects, including dry mouth, tingling in fingers and toes, and there were some serious ones after a year, cognitive problems, etc. And a risk assessment and mitigation strategy, or a risk evaluation mitigation strategy is required actually for the fact that tyranid is part of the component. There are some teratogenetic factors associated with that give rise to birth defects. Could be harmful, but as I'll show you in a second, the company did a retrospective analysis of data that was available and I think showed that the chances of this problem occurring are very, very slight. Nonetheless, this is a sensitive issue, obviously, as it should be, and FDA wants more than just, I think, just an assurance that there will not be a problem. Lorqess had a much bigger patient population in its clinical trials. As I said, in terms of the mean endpoint, didn't do as well, but the categorical, it just did fine. But 37.5% lost at least 5% of their body mass and 16% lost 10%. When you delve into the drug a little bit more, the clinical trial results actually look quite good. On average, the results are about 8% body weight compared to 10%, say, for Qnexa. Depends really how you play with the data. The other thing I want to talk about, because it was in the news quite a bit recently, is this issue of valvulopathy. The fen-phen diet drug that was taken off the market 10 plus years ago created leakage problems in heart valves, hardening. It caused all kinds of issues. And both Lorqess and this fen-phen combo targeted what's called the 5-HT receptor. But it turns out there are 3 different types of receptors. And the company, Arena, demonstrated, I think, quite definitively that their drug, which targets 5-HT2TC, does not have an impact on this heart valve problem. And it turns out the FDA agrees with them in the filing that was published on the website, where they summarized their assessment of this NDA. Or at least one reviewer did. Vivus and Qnexa appeared before the committee, before the NASDAQ, the Endocrinological Metabolic Diseases Advisory Committee, on February 22nd, and on May 10th, Arena and their drug Lorqess appeared. And if we take a look at each submission, the thing I like about the Qnexa one is that you actually have slides. So here you can actually go onto the website and look through the slides that were presented by the FDA to the committee, summarizing the clinical trial results, drawing conclusions on whether or not the drug is effective, looking at some of the results that were presented to demonstrate that the drug was safe, including this Fortress study, which I alluded to recently. It's a retrospective analysis of data to demonstrate that the issue of teratogenicity is not that serious. And we're not going to go through this slide, but it makes for interesting reading, more so than the meeting materials, which in this case is 200 pages worth of information. There's a few things that I will highlight, and I'll just move to them rather quickly. For example, we can look on page 33, if I'm reading my notes correctly, where it talks about the weight loss efficacy after 1 year. And 2 pages later, 3 pages later, there's a table which shows one by one the clinical trials, the combination, how people did on, and the thing I talked about earlier, which is the statistical significance of the results that you're seeing. This document, as I said, is huge, and so sometimes the slides are a better thing to read through, at least first, to at least get the geography of what you're going to be reading if you actually pull this thing up and start going through it. It makes for interesting reading, and I can tell you it's kind of addicting. But it talks about the risk factors as well, including cardiovascular risk. Later on in the document, it goes into the issue of birth defects. Oh, sorry, it was 114. Typing challenged. And there's a large discussion here on this very, very topic. And I mentioned before that the company funded a study of available information, and this is an analysis of the study, to demonstrate at least that the chances of problems occurring are very, very slim. And in response, there's a discussion also in the document about the risk evaluation and mitigation strategy, and the FDA goes through in detail in these documents what has been found before, what was presented to the committee, what the outcome was, questions that were asked, answers given, the complete response letter the company once received, and how it came back and discussed it. The interesting thing in this discussion here is the reviewer talks about the fact that even though there was a very concerted effort excuse me, to ensure that women of childbearing age, or women who were of childbearing age who had a likelihood of becoming pregnant, were excluded from the study, it turns out that a number of pregnancies occurred. So hence this risk evaluation and mitigation strategy to ensure that in the general population we don't have that problem. And there are a list of questions that the agency wanted answered. You can look at those yourself. Answered by the committee, by the way, not by the sponsor Vivus. And then if we go to the Lorqess one, a little bit more paltry because the slides unfortunately weren't presented. But again, it goes through the entire document. Now this one is kind of interesting because if you don't have to dig very far into the introductory briefing material where it starts to talk about the valvulopathy issue, and it really puts it to rest, which is one of the reasons that after this meeting occurred, the stock price more than doubled. The meat and potatoes of the document starts on page 15. Here we have the table of contents. A few pages later, jumps right into the issue of cancer risk. I don't know how many people follow this company, but in the past, this drug rather, in the past, in 2010, at this same committee meeting, the company revealed results that tumors had developed in rats. Now, it turns out it's not as serious as the headline might make it sound. And the company went to a lot of expense and a lot of effort to demonstrate that what was being observed here, while not that pleasant for rats, would have minor, if any, zero, close to zero as you can get statistically, impact for humans. And so if you read through this document, you'll see how they've developed a margin of safety to demonstrate it can't occur in humans. They show mechanistically that this problem occurs in rats but is unlikely to occur in human beings, and that they adjudicated the results by professionals, and the FDA agreed on the professionals, clinical professionals who were chosen. And the argument at the end is, yeah, I guess it's not nice to see tumors develop anywhere, but it's not an issue. For those of you who aren't familiar with how drugs are developed, it's not that uncommon for tumors to appear in rats, particularly when you consider the fact that the doses they are being given, these rats, are enormous. It would be like a human being eating a year's worth of drug every day for 356 days of the year. And by the way, the other thing is, in many cases, these tumors are benign. And even though some of the headlines screamed out that, oh wow, a man who took that drug would develop a 100-pound tumor, I think it's highly unlikely that anyone would walk around with a 100-pound tumor and not have a physician take a peek at it to see what's going on. Oh, by the way, I didn't get to it for the Vivus Qnexa NDA or review material, but you can scroll down and you can look at common adverse effects, and these are detailed. It's a very detailed document that occurred for both drugs. This one actually for Lorqess, but if you go to the other material, you can look at the side effects that I listed earlier that occur for Qnexa. And the FDA gives a list of questions to the committee members that they want addressed. Again, not surprisingly, they raised the issue of valvulopathy, and they raised the issue of cancer. But the thing that really surprised me was that it raised questions related to the March 28th and 29th meeting of the committee. And I say I'm surprised because I understood that meeting to have taken place to develop and improve guidance for future drugs, not current ones. And so nothing that was said in that meeting would necessarily be binding. But the fact of the matter is that it does influence, I guess, how the FDA thinks. Hence, they asked a question on this drug related to that meeting. The results of the meetings were two separate meetings, that there was a 20-2 vote in favor of the Vivus drug and an 18-4 vote in favor of Lorqess. And actually, I learned something from this vote because there was one abstention, and it's the first time I think I've seen an abstention. I didn't know you could do it, but apparently you can. In both cases, they said it was efficacious and should be, and I believe that it will be approved. I think Vivus still has questions to answer to develop a REMS, risk evaluation mitigation strategy with the agency. Typically, these things take time. If they get it done by July 17th, that would be great. I would not be surprised to see it stretch a little bit longer into the future and be completed by the end of the year or early next. But both of these drugs should be approved. There's no sign that Lorqess will be asked to develop a REMS, despite what's been on the web recently. There might be post-approval commitments that the FDA will request, and it's my understanding from the agreement with Eisai, the pharma, that Arena will not be on the hook for most of the funding for those post-approval commitments, but we will see, if there are any. Some excellent websites, resources to look at, including the first second review performance. Google that; it's a phenomenally nice read, and a link actually to PDUFA, which is spelled incorrectly, just to make sure you're watching, but it's the Prescription Drug User Fee Act, and it's legislation that became law in 1993 and has been reviewed 3 or 4 times since to make sure that people who submit an NDA actually fund the FDA so they can hire more reviewers and expedite approval. Everyone's in agreement. This seems to have worked well, and the two documents I talked about earlier focus in on demonstrating how things have improved with the implementation of the DUFA. So with that, I will throw it open to questions. Maybe I'll let Mark talk about the next event that Manifest is hosting.
Well, thanks, Hugh. I think you've given me a much better understanding of every time we hear the disclaimers on any drug that's advertised and how they're always as long as your arm. I think I see where they get all the background data for how long that list is for every single drug that's out there. We do have a question from Nancy. She'd like to, if you would just spend a moment talking about what a normal day in the life of a pharmaceutical scientist is like.
Well, it really depends on what that scientist is. I'm not a bench scientist. I mean, I have a PhD in chemistry, but I got out of the lab a long time ago. I'm a danger to myself and anyone within 100 feet. But it's a good question. I mean, if there are bench scientists listening to this, I think they probably would agree that most of their time at the bench is actually spent sitting at a desk writing reports. A lot of the activity that happens today, not a lot of it, but quite a bit of it is kind of automated. Certainly in the early stage of drug development, there are robotic systems that move things around from wells where experiments are done, depending upon how the response is detected. If it's detected because, let's say there's a fluorescent dye or something like that, it can be completely automated. So, yeah, I think on TV you'd see people running around with pipettes doing experiments in fume hoods. That certainly happens, but I would say the bulk of the work that pharmaceutical people do is sitting at a desk, analyzing results and preparing reports. There is just an ungodly amount of paperwork.
I think that's true in the medical profession in general, more than people come to realize. She'd also like to know with the clinical trials, and I think she's specific to the Vivus and Arena situation here. Did it include any assessment of changes in diet or exercise?
That's a really good point. I should have mentioned this and I forgot. Yes. So, didn't have enough time to go through the guidance in detail, but you can see in the guidance that one of the things that is required when you develop a protocol is that some exercise be included in there. So it turns out that in both clinical trials, in all the clinical trials, but the clinical trials from both companies, they had slightly different protocols. And they had a dietitian work with every single person in the clinical trial, whether they were in the control group or on the placebo. And I had asked a question a few years ago about both the Arena and the Vivus results, and the question was, why in the Arena results did the control group lose more weight than in the Vivus experiments? And I thought it was a pretty good question to ask, because while it was only a couple of percentage points different, it seemed to be different. Well, it turns out they developed the protocol slightly differently. Arena had people talk to dietitians and etc. for a year, and that might have helped keep more folks in the trial, whereas Vivus did it for 3 months. They did the same amount of work with dietitians, but they did it over a shorter period of time. And there was actually a bigger dropout rate in the Vivus trials, slightly bigger. I don't know whether or not the two are related, but yeah, exercise was part of the effort.
That almost sounds like a group phenomenon, or peer pressure, or peer support, or therapist type support also that was involved there.
Well, there was an element of that, I'm sure. I don't know the details, but that would seem to make sense.
Here's a question from Howard. He's asking, in your opinion, do you think that Dendreon will become a profitable drug, or is it just an example of an approved drug that is an example of an economic failure?
That's a good question. I mean, one of the things I often caution people is that, yes, there's a lot of risk in developing a drug, but the hardest thing, and many people know this, is selling. Selling can be the toughest thing, and Dendreon has certainly found that out. I don't know if they sold the drug to a big pharmaceutical company, whether they could be able to market the thing better. I know there's an awful lot of controversy surrounding the drug. It seems to have been successful in clinical trials, otherwise it wouldn't be approved. But but there are people out there that claim that there was all kinds of political pressure employed to get it approved, and I never buy into that kind of conspiracy thinking. But yes, it's really hard to know. I think they should license it. If they can't sell it, and selling, as I said, is hard, maybe they should partner with somebody, if there's anyone out there that's willing to take it on. I mean, the idea in principle should work, the treatment that they're doing. But it's sad to watch what the stock price did, 2 years ago, and where it is today.
Mm-hmm. Well, thanks, Hugh. This helps me understand a lot more. For those of you out there, every once in a while, Hugh will call me with this nugget of what's going on in the development of some pharmaceutical or something, and I have to do some catch up. This gives me a much better understanding of why he gets so excited at certain points in time. I can remember actually having a conversation about the incidence of cancer in rats on the Arena trials several months ago. And Hugh basically saying, this doesn't add up. They shouldn't even be talking about this at this point. Now I understand where he was coming from that night on the phone.
Yeah.
So it's pretty cool stuff.
Well, it's not to be dismissed out of hand by it, but, I just think in the previous committee meeting of 2010, the trouble with clinical trials is a lot of information converges at one point, and it's very close to the approval process. And I think when those long-term toxicity studies were blinded, there probably wasn't enough time to adjudicate the tumors that they saw, the growth that they saw, to make a good enough presentation to the review committee. And the other thing that happened, quite honestly, was when you check through the backgrounds of people on the committee, there probably weren't enough people trained there to know exactly what they were looking at with 100% confidence. So it was just a confluence of some bad things that occurred, and unfortunately, as a result, the drug wasn't approved. But let's hope it's made a better company out of it, and a better company out of Vivus as well.
Well, the questions log is clear, and as Hugh said, we do have a roundtable coming up May 29th, a couple weeks from now, so you can put that on your calendar. We'd love to see you, and been some fairly turbulent results in the market here over the last couple of weeks, from Cisco to the stuff going on in the banking industry to everything else. So I'm sure we'll have some interesting stuff to talk about in a couple of weeks. Hopefully the trends that have been established for the last 13 days of May will not continue between now and then, but only time will tell. So with that, I'll just like to close down and say thanks very much, Hugh. Fantastic presentation.
Thank you.
And we greatly appreciate it. You're getting affirmation of that from some of the attendees. And again, we'll just say thanks and good night, everybody.